So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Torbjorn Fredriksson, who heads he leads the research on e-commerce and digital economy at the UNCTAD and development. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco, and good evening, everyone. It's always terrible to stand in the way of the cocktail, but I hope you can endure this 30 minutes keynote. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation, but I will stay in English. I normally work in the Palais des Nations in Geneva in Switzerland, which is around 3.5 hours drive from here. So for those of you who don't know the territory that well, it's just a short drive. My job normally is to lead UNCTAD's work on e-commerce and the digital economy, so don't be disappointed now if I'm going to have a very economic focus in my presentation today. We know that development is far more than money, but it does help sometimes. 1 year ago, world leaders met in New York at the Summit of the Future to agree on a pact for the future and largely to try to identify some areas that were not properly covered in the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. And one of the elements of that was the Global Digital Compact. And in that compact, there is one particular objective that is about expanding the inclusion in and benefits from the digital economy for all. That's very UN language. We are, together with UNIDO, the UN Industrialization Development Organization, leading the implementation work on the inclusive digital economy. So I thought this is a perfect timing of this conference. It's right at the focus of what we do and what the UN is trying to do. So in my presentation, I will try to reflect a little bit on the concept of an inclusive digital economy and on the goal of ensuring benefits for all, which is, this is a spoiler, we're not heading there right now, and we need to improve on that. I will try to draw on whatever data is available to illustrate these observations, and then also to reflect a little bit on what perhaps needs to be done to improve on the inclusiveness. What is an inclusive digital economy is, of course, the starting point. And we need to think about the two concepts here of inclusiveness and the digital economy. And let's start with the digital economy here. And unfortunately, there is no international agreement on what a digital economy is. It's very difficult to define, it turns out. UNCTAD, the OECD, and others, for instance, the Group of 20, have tried to. And we get to an idea, a conceptualization of it, but there is no precise definition. So we often talk about the core part of the digital economy, which really refers to the fundamental innovations, semiconductors, processes, and core technologies such as computers, telecom devices, and enabling infrastructure, internet, and telecom networks. This is what we typically call the ICT sector in the old days. Then we can expand it a bit to talk about the narrow scope. Then we add ICT products and services that rely on core digital technologies. Now we are familiar with the digital platforms, mobile applications, and various payment services in the digital era. And then the broader scope is referring to what we call digitally enabled sectors in which new activities or business models have emerged or are being transformed as a result of digitalization. And this could be commerce, being e-commerce. We go from finance to digital finance, media to social media, tourism, and so on and so forth. But the main point here is that the digital economy concept is much broader than just internet and broadband connectivity or just the narrow part of producing ICT goods and services. It's also important to keep in mind both the supply side and the demand side. Just to illustrate this thing here, if you look at China's own estimates of how big their digital economy is, if they focus on the core part, it's about 10% of GDP. If they look at the broader part, it arrives at about 30% of GDP. So it really makes a big difference to know what we're talking about. But in general, there is a lot of numbers suggesting that the parts of the digital economy are growing faster than the rest of the economy. So I think it's safe to say that in most countries, the share of the digital economy in GDP is expanding. Okay, inclusiveness. What does it mean? Well, let's actually, I'm going to go back there and leave you here for a while. We need to think about different types of inclusion. What are we comparing? The first is that we can compare between countries, and we can compare within countries. And then there are, of course, different dimensions and aspects to consider. For example, we may consider differences between men and women, between young and old, people of different education and income, people with disabilities versus those that lack disabilities, large and small firms, different sectors, and you can go on, depending on what you're looking at. But the point is that the inclusiveness is also not very well defined. But if you think about the big picture, when the UN and also in many development contexts, when you start talking about the digital divides, the gaps, it's often linked to connectivity. And this is not only because it is important, but it's also one area where we have data. So a little bit look where the lamp pole is, and you will find the key, you can hope. But we do see, if you just look at the overall scheme here, you see it's going up from 2005 to 2023. So with a first glance, it seems that there is more inclusiveness, doesn't it? I mean, we've gone from, according to ITU, from 1 billion people using the internet to more than 5.6 billion people using the internet. That surely is a tendency to more inclusiveness in that sense. In fact, we have gone from 15% of people to 67% of people on the globe that are using the internet. But as you can see, the difference here between Europe and Africa is actually as big as it was in 2005, more or less. In Africa, still only 37%, according to ITU again, are using the internet, and this figure is much lower in rural areas, of course. In addition to that, it's not just having access or being able to use internet in any form and shape. It matters also how much do I have to pay for it, and at what speed can I use the internet. And typically, in the lowest income countries, the speed of broadband is lower, and the cost of using it is relatively high compared to other parts of the world when you consider the income, average income in the countries. And of course, the lower the quality and the higher the cost, the smaller the scope for people and businesses to harness the technology for various needs. And this becomes even more important when we talk about more recent applications like the Internet of Things or the artificial intelligence that is really demanding on the quality and speed of the technology. Another question is, how are we using the internet? And I've just taken one example here. For us who are looking at the economic side of it, then e-commerce is a good illustration of something that is more linked to productive use of the internet. In fact, when you look at many developing countries, the main action when it comes to accessing the internet is to stay in touch with friends and relatives, which is of course very important socially, but it doesn't necessarily lead to value creation or even economic changes. And if you can just compare these two countries here, Egypt and Sweden, you see that it's a slight difference in terms of the internet use percentage. In Sweden, it's about 96% of the people using the internet, and in Egypt, about 73%. It's not a huge difference there. But then look at what are they mainly using it for, the people in Egypt? Well, more than half are using Facebook, but less than 5% are shopping online. It's the same internet. In Sweden, you can see that more people are shopping online than using Facebook. And this is a pattern that you can see in many countries around the world, depending on the income level, on how we'd say the readiness to engage in the digital economy. So here is one reflection. The e-commerce divide is much bigger than the connectivity divide. And if we say in Europe that close to 80% of people are shopping online, it's similar to that here in France. Only about 10% across the African continent are shopping online. Okay, another important aspect of inclusiveness is this thing between men and women. And let's start again with connectivity. And then the difference between men and women has been reduced at the global level. Today, about 70% of men are using the internet, whereas 65% of women are using the internet. There's still a gap, but if you look at other aspects of the digital economy, this gap is very small. You can see that the gap widens when you go into low-income economies, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where many more men are using the internet than women. But in fact, when you control those numbers for the level of income and education, there is no difference between men and women. So it's really other factors that are determining this gap. Now, other areas, the gaps are much more pronounced. And that is, for instance, related to jobs, education, and research. Let's consider the employment in the ICT sector, the core part of the digital economy. This is an area that is very much dominated by men. In both developed and developing countries, men account typically for between 60 and 70% of the sector's jobs. And in some countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Timor-Leste, the share is above 90%. It's very male-dominated. But there are some exceptions also. If you go to the island states of Trinidad and Tobago or Tonga, then in fact men are less represented than women. And this is actually something that has been emphasized a lot in many Caribbean countries, that in terms of the gender gap here, it's often the men that are needed to come up more prominently. We can also say that when men and women are doing similar jobs in the ICT sector, no surprise, men are typically paid more than the women. There is another thing that ILO is measuring, and that is ICT specialists, people that know ICT, software engineers, ICT experts that can work anywhere in the economy, in the government or whatever. And here it's even more male-dominated. So in the European Union, for instance, 4 out of 5 ICT specialists are men. And there's no clear reason why it should be like that. These are often well-paid jobs, so it would be a good opportunity for more women to come into that area. We can also see that women more often mention skills as a barrier to internet use around the world. If you go to more research levels, in the US, 70% of all the artificial intelligence degrees are awarded by the top 5 leading institutions to men. So only 30% to women. Also in the business context, the leadership position, you can see in a study of the top 100 largest tech firms and the top 50 largest e-commerce platforms, only about 23% among the top executives are women. So I could go on, and you can see similar patterns among researchers and where the gaps are most pronounced in parts of Asia. So in summary, I think we can agree that men are much better represented in the digital economy as a whole when you take all these things into account. And this is, of course, not only missed opportunities for women, but it's a missed opportunity for the economies as a whole, that we're not making the most of the skills and talents that we have in the economy. Oops, this is going too fast. I just want to say here a plug for what we do here. And one of the main programs that we have is to support women digital entrepreneurs in developing countries. We're right now working with about 500 women that have founded their digital businesses themselves. And then we organize various kinds of activities to make sure that they can grow faster, that they can raise their voice in policy discussions, and also that they can inspire more women to join that sector. Now, another thing is about creating value and capturing the value that is created in the digital economy. And there is little doubt that digitalization has allowed the world to create a lot of financial value. In 2005, the 10 most valuable companies in the world averaged about 250 billion in market capitalization value. They belong to a traditional old set of industries, such as oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, retail, and banking. There was only one digital tech firm among the top 10, and that was Microsoft. Today, 20 years later, 9 of those 10 top companies are no longer in the list of the large top 10 firms in the world. Instead, digital tech firms have taken over completely. This is from the 14th of October, so it's a few weeks old, but it's basically relevant. And you see the top companies today in the world, not in the digital sector, but in all sectors, are NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, Google or Alphabet, Amazon, Meta Platforms, and Broadcom. And Broadcom is a software company as well. The first non-American, non-digital firm is Saudi Aramco, which is the only oil company on the list today. The other 2 are also tech-related firms with TSMC, which is a Taiwanese semiconductor company, and Tesla, as you know, is the electric car company. Now, if you combine the top 7 here, the combined value is about $21 trillion. This is a big number. It's hard to relate to, perhaps, but the value of that is corresponding to about 7 times the nominal GDP of the entire African continent. 7 companies. What explains this rise of this tremendous wealth accumulation for these companies? Many of them are still controlled by individuals. Even if they are on the stock exchange, the power is still in the hands of individual families. So we identify 3 things. First, the growing importance of data and data flows. The second is the winner-takes-all logic of these industries. And more recently, the higher expectations on the future use of artificial intelligence. So let me touch first on data. This is an illustration of the growing importance of data and data flows. We are looking here at global IP traffic. And 20 years ago, about 100 gigabytes per second was observed of global data traffic on the internet. And by now, 20 years later, we have 382,000 gigabytes of data traffic per second. And the companies that are well placed to collect, analyze, and then monetize these kind of data, which are the result of everything we do on the internet, can be absolutely anything, businesses, governments, people, etc., are in the best position to create and capture value in the digital economy. And this applies especially to the digital platforms. And this is only the beginning. We see the huge increase here just in the past 7 years. But in fact, by the end of this decade, it's expected that mobile data flows, which is the growing part of data flows, will double again. So this is just the beginning. The second thing is the winner-takes-all dynamics. Power in the digital economy is increasingly concentrated. Let's look at some of the top companies here. NVIDIA now has between 70 and 95% of the global market for artificial intelligence chips. Google has 90% of the internet search market, which is a share that has been quite stable for many years. ChatGPT has already conquered more than 80% of the global market for ASI chatbots. Meta, Facebook, covers almost 80% of global social media. In fact, if you go to the Pacific Islands, very few e-commerce platforms are present. They have 3 choices: Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, all owned by Meta. 3 companies account for 2/3 of all the cloud infrastructure market. And no surprise, these are Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft. And then Apple and Google, of course. Imagine everything we do on the mobile phones, whether we have an Android phone or an iPhone, they take 30% more or less commission on all the paid apps, wherever you are in the world. That's a huge moneymaker. And it's very difficult to break into this area. So what we have then as a result, we have few players that shape global data flows, innovation, and digital rules. And I could go on because, of course, they have a strong impact on politics. The digital platforms are today the biggest lobby group in Washington, the biggest lobby group also in Brussels. It used to be other, financial sector, pharmaceutical sector, and so on, but now it's the digital. And then the promise of AI, which is on everyone's, not everyone's, but many people's mind, especially in the policy and the political context. How do you succeed in AI? Well, number one, you need access to good data, and you need to have skills to know what to do with data, and you need a lot of computing power and capacity. These big tech firms on the data side that are already dominating the landscape in digital, they are all well placed in this space. So therefore, it's no surprise that if you rank the top AI firms in the world, they're also the top digital firms and the top companies generally in the world. The world of AI is very concentrated in 2 countries, the United States and China. In fact, 19 out of the top 20 AI firms are in these 2 countries. And same thing if you look at the research. Most research related to AI is undertaken in the US and China. And among the leading AI research organizations, 15 out of 20 are in the US and China. There is not one single one among the top 20 in the European Union. There are some in the UK, and there are some in Switzerland, but none in the European Union. Interestingly also, this is an illustration of the power of some companies. Google, this is a list of the top 25 institutions for top-tier AI research. It's a couple of years old, this chart, but it's basically the same picture. Google produces as many AI research papers as Stanford and MIT together. It's not something you would think. So while more people and businesses around the world have access to and can make use of all kinds of digital services, which is good for all of us in that sense, to the extent that we want to use them, from e-commerce platforms to AI chatbots, the biggest financial games are going to a relatively small number of very large players. And that's why they are so dominant also among the top firms of the world. So in view of what I've said now in the first 10 slides here, current trajectories are not pointing to more inclusiveness. They're going in the direction of less inclusiveness, and they're going towards more concentration of economic value. This is not what the member states of the UN want to achieve. So the big question is what to do about it. But before going there, let me complicate this a little bit and reflect upon the interface here between inclusiveness and environmental sustainability. Because what we're seeing happening to the digital economy now is something very different from just 5 or even more 10 years ago. We came out with this report last year, and it's all available online, of course, if you're interested. But it really tries to look at the environmental footprint of the digital economy over the life cycle of the products that we are producing and using and doing away with in the digital economy. Okay, so we rarely talk about the CO2 emissions from the ICT sector. But if you look at the life cycle of the ICT sector, it is now comparable to the global shipping industry or the global aviation industry. So it's significant, but we don't track it in the same way when we look around. And oops, I will not fall over here. This is linked to the higher speed, more data, cloud computing, platformization, exponential data growth, growing virtuality, which has reduced the digital divides in terms of the pure connectivity, but it's also helping to breach planetary boundaries in a number of ways. And let me look quickly at the production phase of the digital economy, the use phase, and the end-of-life phase. So we talk often about the digital economy as something being quite virtual, It's up in the cloud, something. No, not really. It's a lot of raw materials that go into the digital devices, the infrastructure, the data centers that we are using increasingly. In fact, you can see that if you want to produce a 2 kilograms laptop, you need to take out 800 kilograms of raw materials from the ground in order to get access to all the small things that go into this laptop. The complexity is also greatly increasing. You look at a phone. When we produced phones in the 1960s, a normal phone, fixed type of phone, we needed 10 elements from the periodic table. Then we could produce a phone. When we had the first mobile phones at the beginning of the 90s, then we needed 27 elements from the periodic table. And now the smartphones that we are using today, they require 63 different elements from the periodic table. And that is actually, in one single smartphone, more than half of all the elements known on Earth. This means growing demand for more raw materials. And if you look at cobalt, graphite, and lithium, they are expected to increase. The demand is expected to increase by 500% until 2050. And we are already seeing some concerns about accessing the many minerals and metals that we need. So much so that businesses and governments are considering going into outer space to do mining, as you have heard of. They're also considering going down to the deep seas to do mining. This is a concern. We don't know what would happen with the oceans. We don't know what would happen with all the things that are happening out in space. And who would have control over this? Will it be private companies? Will it be states? Will there be some kind of common approach to this in the world? It's very unregulated right now. Let me turn to the use phase. We are giving particular attention to data centers here, because we have more and more things that we are using to connect to the internet and do various things, to use various kinds of digital services. But if we look at data centers globally, they now, or a few years ago, they consume as much electricity as the entire economy of France. It's about 460 terawatt hours. And consumption, when we did this report, was set to double by 2026. That's next year. And if you look at the electricity grids in certain places, in Ireland already, 20% of all electricity is just used for data centers. And in Dublin, 50% of all electricity is used there. The telecom regulator is flagging the concerns, and they have said we should stop this. We cannot have more data centers. But the government as a whole has preferred to keep them going because they see the value of having all this economic activity in the economy. But there is definitely an issue here of catering to the various demands in the society and in the economy. Singapore put a stop to the data centers when they reached 7%. And in certain parts of the US and Europe, we have similar trends, for instance, in the Netherlands. But it's not only electricity, it's also water. And these data centers, they don't just need any water, they need very pure water. So this has created another concern, for instance, in Latin America, that governments are trying to attract big data centers to follow the AI trend and so on. but they often put them where there is a shortage of water. And this is a big concern. And this question of electricity and water also raises a lot of concerns in Africa. Where should big data centers be placed, if at all? Because there will be it's already at this level of digitalization, electricity is a concern. We can see also here that nowadays the big companies that are running the biggest data centers, they can no longer compensate the increased use of their data with more efficiency to keep the CO2 emissions down. In fact, you see the electricity use has almost tripled from 2018 to 2022, and 2022 is nothing compared to what we're doing today and nothing compared to what we expect will happen by the end of this decade. It's an unequal world in terms of the use of various devices. In the US, in North America here, people now, according to Cisco's estimates, they use per person more than 13 digital devices and connections. And that also factors in Internet of Things type, that you have a connected fridge, you have various games and so on that are played by the kids. Compare that to 9 in Europe, Western Europe, and 1 in Africa. So there's a huge difference here. That means also, of course, that these rich countries are producing much more waste, digital waste. And of course, because we buy many, many more things, we also create more demand for both raw materials and electricity use. So we add to the climate change through this. Today, we see that the waste from these kind of activities has increased by 30% over the past 12 years, up to 2022. And we can also see that the amount of waste produced per capita is much, much higher, of course, in rich countries than in poor countries. In fact, in the least developed countries, it's about 0.2 kilos compared to almost 4 kilos per person per year in the rich countries. Unfortunately, also, much of the waste that is created is not formally taken care of. That means that on the one hand, a lot of hazardous materials are going out in the environment, and also many valuable parts are not recycled to be used again in the digital economy. So this is another inclusiveness aspect. The developing countries, many developing countries, are in a double bind because they are neither able to take full advantage of digitalization because the extent of digitalization is still relatively low in these countries. But on the other hand, they have to live with many of the environmental consequences to the extent that this is leading to more climate change. They are the most vulnerable to deal with the effects of climate change. They often have to deal with a lot of the digital waste, even from the rich countries that are exporting that to them. And they also have to deal with a lot of raw material extraction and the implications of mining, because much of these resources that we need are found in low-income and middle-income countries. So we need to look for ways to address this. And how do we both harness the opportunities that these kind of activities can bring to the countries that need economic opportunities? And how do we avoid rolling over the burden on the developing countries as we move forward? We talk here in the report that it's almost an extreme situation that we have now. We have more and more and more and more digitalization in the rich countries, and we still have huge needs to digitalize more to make sure that countries that are in low-income countries can use the technology for their needs. So we're talking here about the need to curb overconsumption if we want to stay within the limits of this planet. But we still mustn't stop the countries that are trailing far behind to take advantage of what digitalization can offer to them. It's not an easy challenge, but it is a global challenge that we need to look at how to implement. This, we think, will require also more attention to circularity. The digital economy is very linear right now. We extract, we produce, we sell and use, and then we throw it away. Very little goes back into the economy. So this means that we need to look for increasing the lifespan of the things we buy. Can we use them longer? can we design them better for circularity? How do we get the global industry to actually produce smartphones and laptops that don't stop working after 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years? How can we enable repairs, refurbishment, reselling, and more? How can we better take care of the waste? This is, again, a global challenge, and it requires an involvement from governments, from businesses, and from the civil society and the research community. There are many policy areas we need to address, both national and the international ones. And this is where we give a lot of attention to our work from UNCTAD to help member states to address these various areas that are mentioned here. I will not go into them because we're running out of time. When it comes to the international side, we have highlighted especially 3, the data policies. We need to have data governance rules that stop this from being just concentrated in one place and make it possible for all users of the internet to see the advantages from the data generated. We need to have more competition policies that address the market concentration. Currently, competition policies are national or in the EU regional, but the internet is global. These companies are global dominant players in the sectors. So we need to think about how can one go to global competition policies. Taxation, just before this session, we had a very interesting discussion on taxation. Many developing countries need to also tap into the opportunities for generating revenues as a result of digitalization. And we need to look at ways to tax platforms, even if they don't have a physical presence in your country. Then, of course, development cooperation is extremely important still. In fact, it's still, if you look at the global picture of ODA, the digital dimension is not so much emphasized still, although it can play a role in all parts of development policies. What are we doing in the UN? Well, they talked about the Global Digital Compact. 2 areas that we are very much involved in is related to this inclusive digital economy objective, where we're working with UNIDO to co-lead. And then we're also working in a lead role for the data governance things. And I would say thanks to our work in this area, there is now a working group in the Commission on Science, Technology for Development where actually all the member states have a chance to have a say. And not only the member states, also the academic community, the private sector, and civil society, and the international organization. It's a tremendously difficult task to come up with global solutions to data governance because it's so fragmented and it's so strategically important for member states. And I doubt that the US and China are interested in really coming to one global solution. But it's important that we start this discussion. AI is another area that is in focus under the Global Digital Compact, but there ITU, UNESCO, and the Office of Digital and Emerging Technologies are in the lead. For your information also, since this is the global conference on digital now this year, the World Summit on the Information Society that was created 20 years ago is having a review going on right now in New York, where the outcome should be agreed upon at the end of this year. It's a very unfinished business. We need to do much more, much better, with a focus on the inclusive, with a focus on what people and what businesses need in developing countries. We need more collaboration. There's still a tendency of us competing rather than collaborating with each other. We need to have more focus on inclusiveness and sustainability. Sustainability has come only recently into the picture in the UN for the digital. And we need much more involvement of low and middle income countries in the decision-making places so that it's not only driven by the biggest economies and firms of the world. And we do need more funding. And everyone is asking for more funding. We know that's nothing new. But if you look at this last comparison, this was the market capitalization value of top 7 firms, all digital, all benefiting from everything happening in the digital world. 7 times bigger than African GDP. It is 100 times the value of all official development assistance from all the OECD countries. So clearly, there should be possibilities to extract some more money to help developing countries to get something better out of this fast evolving digital economy. Thank you very much.